So in this video, we're going to take a look at relativism in ethics. And relativism is essentially opposed to, or the opposite of, universalism in ethics. So there are a couple of ethical relativist theories to take a look at, and then there's a host of universalist ethical theories that we'll take a look at in the future. But for this video, let's just focus on ethical relativism. And that breaks down into essentially two different camps. One, the first of which is ethical subjectivism, and the other is cultural relativism. And a good way to kick off a discussion of ethical relativism in general would be with the philosopher David Hume from the 1700s. And this is a quote from him. He said, "Take any action allowed to be vicious, willful murder, for instance. Examine it in all lights and see if you can find that matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. You can never find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you toward this action. Here is a matter of fact, but 'tis the object of feeling, not reason." Now, of course, this is in the parlance and speech of and writing style of the 1700s, but essentially what he's saying is that for everything that you think is actually vicious and morally wrong, when you look out into the world and you see cruelty happening, right? And you think, oh, that is just wrong. Or you see somebody stealing from somebody else. That is just wrong. Or heck, murder, willful murder, right? You look out and you say, that is a morally bad thing. It is wrong, and you condemn it. He's saying, where do you really find the actual wrongness? It's not something you can empirically discover. Like if I pick up my cup of coffee and say it weighs, X ounces, that's a quantifiable empirical feature of the coffee. Or if I pick up my stapler and say it is hard and it is this long and it makes this noise, right? Those are quantifiable empirical features of the stapler. But if you look at a murder, if you see a murder happening, where are you going to see that stuff that we just call wrongness? You may see harm, you may see pain, but that's not the same as seeing wrongness. And this was his point. He's saying, really, every time you look out into the world and you make a judgment of rightness or wrongness, goodness or badness, it is nothing more than a reflection of your own feelings towards it. It's nothing about the act or the thing itself. And that essentially captures ethical relativism in a nutshell. So now let's break down the two different sub-varieties of ethical relativism. Once again, ethical relativism is a general term, and we're going to look at two specific varieties of it. And the first is ethical subjectivism. And that essentially states that our moral opinions are just that. They're opinions. And morality is based on our feelings and nothing more. You can see how this reflects what Hume was saying in the previous slide. So there is no objective right or wrong. And when you say something's wrong, really all that amounts to is you're stating your disapproval of it. So anytime you say, for instance, X, whatever X might be, X is, let's say, morally acceptable, or X is right, or X is good, or X ought to be done, right? Let's imagine that X stands for charity. In this case, charity is morally acceptable. Charity is right. Charity is good. Charity ought to be done. Anytime you make any of these proclamations, an ethical subjectivist would say all that really amounts to is that you particularly approve of X. Or you, in our more specific example, you particularly approve of charity. And that's it. There's nothing essentially acceptable, right, good, or ought to be doneness about charity itself. It's a reflection of how you feel. So further, this theory is about the nature of moral judgments. It's not a theory about what things are good and what things are bad, and it's not telling you what you ought to do. So in that sense, it's descriptive. It's not prescriptive. It's describing the nature of moral judgments. It's not prescribing to you what you ought to do. And under this theory, as long as you're honestly reporting your feelings, you can't be wrong. I mean, that is a logical extension and a logical consequence of holding this position. So we're going to take a moment and read through the next slide. It's, once I put it up here, it'll be like, oh, because it's just full of words. But it's a killer example of ethical subjectivism at its worst. So I'll read along with you. So this is a quote from somebody. Then I learned that all moral judgments are value judgments, that all value judgments are subjective, and that none can be proved to be either right or wrong. I even read somewhere that the Chief Justice of the United States had written that the American Constitution expressed nothing more than collective value judgments. Believe it or not, I figured out for myself what apparently the Chief Justice couldn't figure out for himself. That if the rationality of one value judgment was 0, multiplying it by millions would not make it one whit more rational. Nor is there any reason to obey the law for anyone, like myself, who has the boldness and daring, the strength of character to throw off its shackles. I discovered that to become truly free, truly unfettered, I had to become truly uninhibited. And I quickly discovered that the greatest obstacle to my freedom, the greatest block and limitation to it, consists in the unsupportable value judgment that I was bound to respect the rights of others. I asked myself, who were these others? Other human beings with human rights? Why is it more wrong to kill a human animal than any other animal, a pig or a sheep or a steer? Is your life more to you than a hog's life to a hog? Why should I be willing to sacrifice my pleasure for the one than for the other? Surely you would not, in this age of scientific enlightenment, declare that God or nature has marked some pleasures as moral or good and others as immoral or bad. In any case, let me assure you, my dear young lady, that there is absolutely no comparison between the pleasure I might take in eating ham and the pleasure I anticipate in raping and murdering you. That is the honest conclusion to which my education has led me after the most conscientious examination of my spontaneous and uninhibited self. So I'll just give you a second here to think, to wonder about who might have said this, and I'll give you a hint. It's a serial killer. Boom. That was Ted Bundy. Now, here are some standard objections to ethical subjectivism as a theory, so that when ethical subjectivism is proposed, as a theory about ethics and morals in general. These are the standard objections to the theory. First, some say that it's a self-refuting theory or self-contradictory theory. And further, it's contrary to our moral experience. It flies in the face of our everyday experience. So as far as the self-refuting aspect is concerned, consider this statement. Right? All ethical statements are relative. Can any of you see the contradiction inherent, the logical contradiction inherent in this statement? If you're saying all ethical statements are relative, that would include this statement itself, which means the truth of this statement is relative to. In other words, you're not entitled to use a universal quantifier like all, and then say all things are relative, right? Because that would mean the truth value of that statement is relative to, and that effectively means that your statement's meaningless. So that's one common objection. Also, ethical subjectivism can't account for our fallibility or our ability to be wrong about things. Because if everything is relative to the perceiving subject, if all matters are relative to the perceiving subject, all ethical matters, that is, and that's the truth of the matter, then how is it that we can find each other wrong so often? How is it that we can find ourselves wrong? How can you experience regret for something that you've done if it was just a matter of opinion at one time and there's no higher standard to which you can possibly refer? All of that starts to melt down when ethical subjectivism is held as the main explanatory theory behind morality and ethics. That's another common objection. Further, it can't account for disagreement in ethics. If it was really the case, like metaphysically the case, that there was no absolute or universal truth in certain ethical judgments, it was all just a matter of opinion disguised in language. If that were the case, then how come we disagree so often? We would know it was just a matter of opinion. We wouldn't have such vehement arguments and fights and even wars over these things if we all knew this ultimate truth, that it just boils down to a matter of feeling and opinion. That's another common objection to ethical subjectivism as a theory. Also, ethical subjectivists still behave as if there's an objective right or wrong. This is a common everyday objection to this theory. If you are a self-proclaimed ethical subjectivist, chances are you still go through the world feeling as if you've been wronged or done right by this person or that person. So that flies in the face of everyday experience as well. And then also, ethical subjectivism entails an unacceptable moral equivalence. All of these objections are related, but we're just articulating them carefully. So for instance, under ethical subjectivism, Ted Bundy's moral views are no better or worse than yours. They're just different. It'd be almost like arguing about which flavor of ice cream is better, vanilla or chocolate. It seems senseless, right? I mean, you can play around with that and have a fun argument if you want to argue that mint chocolate chip is the best ice cream and strawberry is the worst. You can play with that, but I don't think many of us take those sorts of arguments very seriously, right? But under ethical subjectivism, really, Ted Bundy's moral feelings are no better or worse, right? You can't look at Ted Bundy and go, this is appalling and this is wrong. It's just different. He likes one flavor, you like another. Not much to argue about. So now that we've taken a look at ethical subjectivism, we'll take a look at the other sub-variety of ethical relativism, and that's cultural relativism. So this is Ruth Benedict, who is a very renowned anthropologist, and she wrote a very famous book called Patterns of Culture. And her quote about sums up cultural relativism as a theory. And she said, "Morality differs in every society, and it's a convenient term for socially approved habits." So, once again, cultural, just like ethical subjectivism, which says there's no such thing as universal truth or falsity in ethics, with ethical statements, right? So ethical subjectivism says anytime you say this or that is wrong or this or that is right, all it amounts to is an expression of your feeling. There's no universal truth that you can find or falsity when you make those statements. Cultural relativism is very similar to that, except it just extends to the culture rather than just the individual. So a cultural relativist would say there is some truth and falsity to ethical statements, but that truth and falsity is determined by the culture in which you find those statements operating, right? Again, there's no universal truth or falsity to any sort of ethical statements or judgments, but the truth and falsity can be found and is delimited by the culture in which you find those particular statements being uttered, practiced, and impressed upon one another. So some basic tenets of cultural relativism. Different societies have different moral codes. And there is no objective standard that can be used to judge one societal code better than another. You can't appeal to any outside source that is overarching, right? All these are just different moral codes. The moral code of our own society, for instance, has no special status. It's one among many. And once again, there's no universal truth in ethics. That is, there are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. And further, the moral code of a society determines what is right within that society. So if the moral code says that an action is right, then it actually is right, at least in that society. And it's arrogant, actually, to try to judge the conduct of other peoples. We should be tolerant toward the practices of other cultures because, once again, there's no absolute or universal truth. Just different culturally determined, culturally constructed moral codes with no overarching standard that could apply to all people at all times. That is what that's the thinking behind cultural relativism. And so here's a few examples of cultural relativism. So cultural relativism can be, you can look at it from the present and just look and kind of take a survey of all the cultures around the world, right? It can be something that just is present oriented, or it can be historically oriented. So essentially cultural relativism doesn't just say, look, examine the cultures around the world and you'll see all these different sort of moral codes, and that means that there is no absolute truth. It can also be historical. It can be look back into the past and see how codes have differed from time to time and people to people. And for a cultural relativist, that is also evidence that there's no absolute truth in ethics. So my examples here are, for instance, this is a historical example, usury. Usury is the practice of lending money at an interest rate, which to us today seems like regular business as usual, right? You want to buy a car and you don't have the full cash or credit on hand to buy it. You forget the credit part. You don't have the cash to buy it outright. You finance it at an interest rate most of the time, or a mortgage, or anything else that you finance, right? The idea of interest is kind of built into our modern society, but that wasn't always the case. Hundreds of years ago, this was considered an immoral practice. And it was considered immoral because essentially the idea was anybody who had to borrow money from somebody else was already in such a rough position that the prospective lender would be essentially exploiting somebody who is down on their luck and in need, that rather than being charitable, you are exploiting somebody else's need by charging them interest for something rather than being brotherly or sisterly, for instance. But obviously, so this was considered immoral. This interest charging was considered immoral at one time, but not any longer. Right? And also, another example is some Inuit practices. And it's my understanding that this is mostly some of these Inuit practices that I'm going to describe are not practiced any longer. But it's understood that at least in the past, some Inuit tribes have practiced, and they were nomadic tribes. And they would practice, for instance, patricide, which is the killing of elderly parents or parents, but in their case, the elderly and infirm, or infanticide, which is the killing of babies, of infants. And the idea here was that because they're nomadic and traveling from place to place for food and with the seasons and shelter, that they had to stay on the move, and someone who would get too old to keep up with the tribe or that was born unfit to keep up with the tribe would be mercifully put to death. And in the case of the elderly parents, it's my understanding that when this would happen, the parents understood that the elderly parents understood it was time for them to go as well. They had been brought up under in this culture, and they had seen it happen before. It was part of their lifestyle, as I understand it. But patricide and infanticide today in this culture, in the American culture, is obviously not only considered immoral, but it's highly illegal as well. Couple other examples: Jivaro and Shrunken heads. So this is an example of a practice from a tribe in the Amazon, the shrinking of heads. And it's my understanding that this tribe would capture opponents or not opponents, but enemies, and take their head and developed a technique for shrinking them. And they'd even give these to, like, warriors from the tribe would shrink the heads and give these to prospective wives, for instance. Instead of a box of candy or a bouquet of flowers, you get a shrunken head because it shows virility and strength and a lot of promise as a potential, marriage partner. But obviously, in this country and many other countries, we look at this quite differently. They didn't see any sort of moral problem with this practice. Other cultures do. And then honor violence is another good example. Any country or culture, let's say, that practices honor violence, wherein let's say, for example, a female is raped, and when and if the family or village finds out about this, they stone her or beat her because her honor has been destroyed. That's considered what one ought to do in certain cultures, but thankfully not in all cultures. So these are all examples of cultural relativism. And then there are some standard objections to cultural relativism as a theory that is meant to explain ethics and morality. And the first is, if cultural relativism is true, then we could no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own, or need to be changed for that matter. So let me give you a for instance here. Some cultures in Africa still practice female genital mutilation. And many groups and peoples around the world find this morally reprehensible and wrong. But if cultural relativism is the law of the land, if that is the absolute truth, then what ground does any culture really have to criticize, much less attempt to change the practices of another culture by saying, this is wrong, you can't do that to these females? What grounds do you have if cultural relativism is the absolute and universal law of the land, right? And relatedly, the idea of social reform and social reformers would have to be reconsidered, because we couldn't even criticize our own society, let alone that of others. Because again, the ultimate truth is morality is just a convenient term for socially approved habits, and that is it. There is no universal right or wrong, good or bad. And can't explain moral progress because it identifies morality with maintaining the status quo. So to take a look at our own country then, how can you explain, let's imagine when the civil rights movement and when and Martin Luther King, for instance. The civil rights movement and Martin Luther King are generally looked at as moral improvements and moral progress within this country. But how do you explain progress if everything is just a bunch of habits, right? So progress, the notion of any kind of progress means you're progressing ahead of where you were and toward something else, toward a better state. But how can you even make that judgment if you don't have a better state in mind? And a better state implies a state that is more absolute than any individual state that might be existing at that particular time. We can't look, so the objection goes, if cultural relativism is the truth, then how can you say that we are now better than we were? All you could say is we are now different than we were. And there's something that hits us in the gut that's kind of unacceptable about that. Somehow things seem to be better as a result, for instance, of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, not just different, right? And also another common objection to cultural relativism as a theory is that it encourages blind conformity to cultural norms rather than rational analysis of moral issues. Because if it's the case, once again, that there is no progress, that things are just different and cultures are just different, then somehow that is thought to encourage conformity, because there is no more universal or standard of excellence, let's say, to progress towards. Personally, I think that last objection's a little weak, but it's just a common one that's kicked around. So that was ethical relativism in general, and its two subvarieties of ethical subjectivism and cultural relativism. And for each of these, we covered some of the standard objections to these theories.